No one in that bar spoke up when Astrid Vaughn laughed loud enough for everyone to hear and said, "You? A man like you? How could you ever make any woman happy?" The man she aimed at, Henry Cole, a quiet single father, didn't get angry. He just leaned down, close to her ear, and whispered one sentence. Astrid went pale. The glass in her hand trembled, and the room went silent because they understood. She'd just insulted the wrong person. The lounge on 8th Street had the kind of lighting that made everyone look better than they were. Amber pendants casting warm pools across mahogany tables, soft jazz threading through conversations that rose and fell like tide. It was the type of place where successful people went to unwind after long weeks, where wine came in glasses with stems too delicate to trust, and where judgment flowed as freely as the top-shelf bourbon. Henry Cole sat at a corner table, a glass of water in front of him. He'd come in to kill the 40 minutes before his shift started at the industrial complex 3 blocks east. Night maintenance didn't start until 11, and the apartment he shared with his daughter felt too quiet after he'd tucked her into bed at her grandmother's house. Sometimes the silence there was harder than the noise of hydraulic presses and conveyor belts. He was 36, built lean from years of physical work, with hands that showed the evidence of fixing things that broke. His face had settled into an expression that most people read as distant, not unfriendly, just somewhere else. The kind of face that didn't invite questions. He wore jeans and a clean but faded work shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Nothing about him said "notice me." At the table 15 feet away, Astrid Vaughn held court. She was 33 and looked like someone who'd figured out early that beauty was leverage. Tailored blazer, silk blouse, hair that fell in calculated waves. Everything about her presentation was intentional, from the wine she ordered to the way she angled herself in her chair. She worked in corporate consulting, the kind that paid well because it required telling other people what they were doing wrong. Tonight she was with 3 friends, women who orbited her energy, who laughed when she laughed and fell quiet when she made pronouncements. They were deep into their second bottle, deep into the kind of conversation that alcohol made feel profound. "I'm telling you," Astrid was saying, her voice carrying. "Most men don't even know what they're doing. They think just showing up is enough." One of her friends, a woman named Claire, nodded. "It's the confidence without competence. They expect credit for trying." "Trying," Astrid repeated, like the word itself was funny. "God. Remember that guy I dated last year? Thought being nice was a personality." The table erupted in knowing laughter. Henry didn't react. He'd learned a long time ago that some conversations weren't meant to include him, that the world was full of people working through their own disappointments out loud. He checked his watch. 32 minutes until he had to clock in. But Astrid had noticed him. Maybe it was the way he sat. Still, self-contained, not performing for anyone. Maybe it was that he hadn't looked over even once while she'd been talking. Whatever it was, it irritated her in a way she couldn't quite name. "Look at that guy," she said, gesturing with her wine glass toward Henry. Not discreetly. Loud enough that he'd hear. "That's exactly what I mean." Her friends glanced over. Henry felt their eyes but didn't turn. "What about him?" Claire asked. "Everything," Astrid said. "Look at him. Sitting alone, drinking water. Probably waiting for someone who's not coming." Astrid, another friend started, but Astrid was already on a roll. "That's the kind of man who goes home to an empty apartment and wonders why. No presence, no energy, just there." She took a sip of wine. "I guarantee you he's never made a woman feel anything." The words landed in Henry's chest like stones, but he didn't flinch. His hand tightened slightly on the glass. That was all. Because the truth was, he'd heard worse. He'd heard it from his own mother-in-law, 3 years ago, when grief was still sharp enough to cut. If you'd been enough for her, maybe she wouldn't have pushed herself so hard. As if working 2 jobs while pregnant had been his failure instead of their shared choice, their shared dream of buying a house before the baby came. He'd heard it from the married couple next door who stopped inviting him to dinners after his wife died. "It's just awkward, you know. A single man." As if his grief made him dangerous. as if loss was contagious. He'd heard it in the silence of women who smiled at him in grocery stores, and then saw his daughter and recalculated, deciding he was too complicated, too much work, too weighted with a past that wasn't their problem. He'd watched their expressions change from interest to polite distance in the span of a heartbeat, and he'd learned to expect it. His wife, Sarah, had died 3 years ago from a postpartum hemorrhage that happened so fast, the doctors barely had time to explain it. 1 minute she was holding their daughter, tired but glowing. The next, alarms were screaming, and nurses were running, and Henry was being pushed out of the room, while someone he couldn't see shouted medical terms he didn't understand. He'd lost her in 27 minutes. And in the 3 years since, he'd learned that people didn't know what to do with widowed men. They assumed he was broken, or angry, or desperately seeking a replacement. They couldn't imagine that he was just trying to keep breathing, keep working, keep showing up for the daughter who had her mother's eyes, and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. So when Astrid Vaughn announced to her table that he was the kind of man who couldn't satisfy anyone, Henry just sat there. He'd developed a tolerance for cruelty. Not immunity, tolerance. There was a difference. But Astrid wasn't done. She was watching him now, openly, and something about his lack of reaction felt like resistance. Like he was refusing to play a game she was winning. It made her push harder. The wine had loosened something in her. Or maybe it had just given her permission to say what she'd been thinking for months about men in general. About how disappointing they all turned out to be. How they promised intensity and delivered mediocrity. How they wanted credit for showing up when showing up was the absolute minimum. I mean, honestly, she said, louder now. Aware that the bartender had paused mid-pour to listen. What woman is going to be impressed by a guy who probably goes home to watch sports and fall asleep on the couch? That's the problem with men like that. They think just existing is enough. They don't understand that a woman needs more than just stability. She said the word like it was a disappointment. Like it was something weak people settled for. We need someone who can make us feel alive. Someone with actual presence. One of her friends shifted uncomfortably. Astrid, maybe. I'm just being honest, Astrid said, cutting her off. Look at him. He's not even reacting. That's exactly what I'm talking about. No fire. No passion. Just flat. Like he's already given up. She leaned back in her chair, satisfied with her analysis, feeling the familiar rush of being right, of winning an argument no one else was having. A man like that? He'd never satisfy a woman. He wouldn't even know how. Probably hasn't had a woman interested in him in years. Can you blame them? The words hung in the air, ugly and mean. And for just a second Astrid felt something flicker in her chest. Doubt, maybe, or shame. But she pushed it down. She was just telling the truth. People needed to hear the truth sometimes. The bar seemed quieter suddenly. A few people at nearby tables had stopped their own conversations, not sure if they should intervene or pretend they hadn't heard. Henry set his glass down carefully. He didn't look at her yet. His jaw worked once, twice. Then he stood. For a moment, Astrid felt a flicker of something. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. He was taller than she'd realized. And the way he moved was different from what she'd assumed. Not aggressive, but deliberate. Controlled. He walked toward her table. Her friends went very still. Henry didn't stop until he was standing right beside Astrid's chair. Close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at him. Close enough that the whole bar could see he wasn't shouting, wasn't making a scene. He just leaned down, his voice low, meant only for her. I know what it feels like, he said quietly, to make a woman feel safe enough to fall apart and strong enough to put herself back together. I know what it sounds like when someone says your name like it's the only word that matters. I was married to a woman who looked at me every single day like I was her choice, not her compromise. Astrid's breath caught. Henry's voice didn't rise, didn't harden. And I can tell, he continued, just by listening to you, that you've never had that. Not once. You've had men who wanted you. Men who tried to impress you. But none of them ever saw you enough to stay. He straightened up. Looked at her for just a second. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just clear. That's not about me, he said. That's about you. Then he walked away. The silence that followed was the kind that makes people forget how to move. Astrid sat frozen, her wine glass still in her hand, but forgotten. Her face had gone from flushed with alcohol and confidence to something paler, more exposed. No one at her table spoke. Claire was looking down at her own drink. The other two women exchanged glances that said they wanted to be anywhere else. Astrid's mouth opened slightly, like she was going to respond, going to laugh it off, going to say something cutting that would put the power back in her corner. But nothing came. Because the worst part wasn't what he'd said. It was that he was right. She dated dozens of men. Successful men. Attractive men. Men who took her to expensive restaurants and said the right things and never, not once, made her feel like she could stop performing. Every relationship had been a negotiation. Every interaction a test she was running to see if they'd fail. And they always did, eventually in ways that proved her theory that men were disappointed. But the truth, the one she'd never said out loud even to herself, was that she'd never let any of them close enough to pass. She'd never stopped calculating long enough to be seen. And somewhere deep in the machinery of her competence and her control, she knew that what she called standards was really just armor. Henry had seen through it in 30 seconds. She wanted to be angry. Anger would have been easier. But what she felt instead was something closer to shame, mixed with a disorienting sense of exposure, like she'd been walking around with her whole strategy visible, and everyone had been too polite to mention it until now. Across the bar, Henry paid for his water and left. He didn't look back. Didn't wait to see her reaction. He just walked out into the November cold and headed toward the industrial complex where his shift was about to start. Behind him, Astrid sat very still. "Are you okay?" Claire finally asked, her voice careful. Astrid nodded automatically, but her hands were shaking. She set down the wine glass before anyone could see. "I'm fine." She wasn't. No, turn out. Henry's daughter, Matilda, was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes. Dark, serious, too old for her age. She was small for 7, with hair that Henry still hadn't quite figured out how to braid properly, though he tried every morning before school. 4 days after the incident at the bar, Astrid saw them together. It was a Saturday afternoon at Morrison Park, one of those unseasonably warm November days where parents brought their kids outside to burn off energy before winter locked everything down. Astrid had come to meet a friend for coffee at the cafe on the park's edge, but the friend was late, so she'd taken a table outside. That's when she saw him. Henry was sitting on a bench near the playground, watching Matilda navigate the monkey bars with the kind of focus that suggested this was serious business. The girl was talking to herself, narrating her movements. Henry wasn't on his phone. Wasn't distracted. He was just there. Present, ... When Matilda made it across and dropped to the ground, triumphant, Henry stood and walked over. Astrid watched as he crouched down to her level, not talking down to her, but meeting her where she was. The girl said something that made him smile. A real smile that changed his whole face. And then she threw her arms around his neck. He hugged her back like she was the most important thing in the world. Astrid felt something crack in her chest. This was the man she'd called flat, passionless, incapable of making a woman feel alive. And here he was, being the entire world for a 7-year-old girl who'd already lost her mother. Here he was, showing up every single day for someone who depended on him completely. Not for credit, not for recognition. Just because that's what love looked like when it wasn't performed for an audience. She thought about what he'd said in the bar. About being chosen. About making someone feel safe enough to fall apart. For the first time in a long time, Astrid wondered if she'd built her entire life around avoiding exactly that kind of vulnerability. The realization didn't come all at once. It came in pieces over the next 2 weeks. Astrid went back to work. Had meetings. Made recommendations. Went on a date with a man from her gym who was objectively attractive and successful, and said all the right things over dinner. And she felt nothing. Worse than nothing. She felt like she was watching herself perform, like the whole interaction was a script she'd written years ago, and was now just reciting. When he walked her to her car and leaned in for a kiss, she turned her head. "I'm sorry," she said. I don't think this is going to work." He looked confused. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," she said. And meant it. He hadn't. He'd done everything exactly right according to the rules she'd set. That was the problem. She started noticing things she'd ignored before. The way her friends' conversations always circled back to complaints about men, about dating, about how disappointing everyone was. The way she'd trained herself to spot flaws immediately, to find the disqualifying detail before she could get attached. She thought about all the men she'd dated and discarded. Had any of them actually been that bad? Or had she just been too defended to let any of them matter? One night, alone in her apartment with a glass of wine she didn't really want, Astrid pulled out her phone and scrolled through old photos. There was a picture from 2 years ago, her and a man named David at a charity gala. He'd been kind, patient, interested in her work. And she'd ended it after 3 months because he'd wanted to introduce her to his parents, and that had felt like too much pressure. She couldn't even remember his last name now. The wine sat untouched. The apartment was quiet in a way that felt heavy instead of peaceful. And Astrid had to admit something she'd been avoiding for a very long time. She was lonely. Not alone. She had friends, had a full social calendar that took her from Monday morning coffee meetings to Friday night dinners to Sunday brunch reservations. Had a career that kept her busy 70 hours a week. Had a life that looked full from the outside. But lonely in the way that only happens when you've spent years making sure no one gets close enough to hurt you. And you wake up one day and realize you've succeeded so completely that no one's close enough to matter either. Lonely in the way that means coming home to an empty apartment every single night and feeling relief instead of longing. Lonely in the way that means you can't remember the last time someone touched you with gentleness instead of desire. Lonely in the way that means you've forgotten what it feels like to be known. She thought about her last real relationship, if you could even call it that. A man named Thomas who'd lasted 5 months before he'd said, during an argument she couldn't even remember the cause of now, "I don't think you actually want to be with anyone. I think you want to win. And I'm tired of being the game." She'd been furious then. Called him weak. Said he couldn't handle a strong woman. But, sitting in her quiet apartment with untouched wine, she wondered if he'd been right. Henry had been right. She'd never had what he described. She'd never let herself. It took her another week to work up the courage. She didn't plan it exactly. She just found herself driving past Morrison Park on a Saturday afternoon. And when she saw Henry's truck in the parking lot, she pulled in. He was there with Matilda again. Same bench. Same watchfulness. Astrid got out of her car before she could talk herself out of it. She walked across the grass, her heart beating harder than it should have been. When she was 10 feet away, Henry looked up. Recognition crossed his face, followed by something guarded. Matilda was on the swings, pumping her legs, oblivious. "Hi," Astrid said. Henry stood, positioning himself slightly between her and his daughter. Protective. "Hi, she stopped. Started again. "I owe you an apology." He didn't say anything. Just waited. "What I said that night," Astrid continued, "in the bar, it was cruel. And it was wrong. And I'm sorry." Henry's expression didn't change. "Okay? I don't have an excuse," she said. "I was drunk, but that's not a reason. I was showing off for my friends, but that doesn't make it better. The truth is, I said those things because you didn't react to me the way I'm used to men reacting. And then that bothered me, and I took it out on you." She looked down at her hands. "You were right. About all of it. I've never let anyone close enough to—" She stopped. This was harder than she'd thought it would be. "I've been so focused on not being hurt that I forgot how to let people matter." The swing set creaked. Matilda called out, "Dad? Watch this." Henry turned his head. "I see you, sweetheart." When he looked back at Astrid, Something in his face had softened slightly. Not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition of effort. I appreciate you saying that, he said. I don't expect you to forgive me, Astrid said quickly. I just wanted you to know that I heard you, and you were right. For a long moment, they stood there in the November sun, two people who'd collided once in the worst possible way, and were now trying to figure out if there was any path forward from that. The thing you said, Henry finally spoke, about making someone feel alive. You weren't completely wrong. Astrid looked up, surprised. My wife, she used to say that I was too steady. That she wished I'd surprise her more, take risks, be spontaneous. His voice was quiet, factual. After she died, I wondered if she'd been bored. If I'd failed her somehow by being exactly who I was. He glanced toward Matilda. But then, I realized something. She never left. In 15 years, through all the time she said she wanted more excitement, more adventure, she stayed. Because steady mattered to her more than she wanted to admit. Safety mattered. Being chosen every day mattered. He looked back at Astrid. So you're not wrong that some women want fireworks. But the ones worth keeping want someone who shows up. That's the hardest part. Not the beginning. The showing up. No when she. And there's I showed you. Astrid felt her throat tighten. I don't think I'm brave enough for that. For what? Letting someone stay long enough to see all the broken parts. Henry smiled slightly. Most people don't, he said. Not at first. Matilda ran over, breathless and grass-stained. She looked at Astrid with open curiosity. Hi, Astrid said. I'm Matilda. That's my dad. I'm Astrid. It's nice to meet you. The girl studied her for a moment with those serious eyes. Then she turned to Henry. Can we get ice cream? Sure, Henry said. He looked at Astrid, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite an invitation but wasn't rejection either. Just a question. Astrid hesitated. This wasn't a date. This wasn't even really forgiveness. But it was something. A door left slightly open. I should let you two go, she said. Henry nodded. Take care, Astrid. You too. She walked back to her car, and she didn't cry until she was 3 blocks away, stopped at a red light with her hands gripping the steering wheel. They weren't sad tears exactly. Just release. The kind that happens when you've been holding your breath for years, and finally remember how to exhale. 2 months passed. Astrid didn't see Henry again, but she thought about him often. About what he'd said. About the way he'd seen through her so clearly. She started making changes. Small ones at first. She stopped going to the bar on 8th Street, realized that the conversations there made her feel worse, not better. She called David, the man from the charity gala, and apologized for how things had ended. They didn't get back together. But he appreciated it, and the conversation felt like closing a loop that had been left open. She went to therapy. Actually went, not just talked about going. Sat in that uncomfortable chair and said out loud all the things she'd been avoiding. That she was terrified of being left, so she left first. That she'd turned her fear into a weapon and called it standards. That she was tired of being right all the time if it meant being alone. Her therapist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, asked her one session, "When was the last time you let yourself need someone?" Astrid couldn't remember. Work became less consuming. She turned down a promotion that would have meant more travel, more hours, more distance from any chance at a real life. Her boss was surprised. Her friends were shocked. Astrid just felt relieved. On a Saturday in January, she went back to Morrison Park. Not to find Henry. She didn't even know if he'd be there. Just to sit on a bench and watch people live their lives. Families. Brown and Alma. Siwajar. Couples. Died she. Lonely people like her, trying to figure out what came next. Henry wasn't there. But that was okay. She was learning that healing wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was about sitting still long enough to feel what you'd been running from. It was about admitting you didn't have all the answers. It was about being brave enough to be seen, even when, especially when, What people saw wasn't polished or perfect or in control. 3 weeks later, she ran into him at a coffee shop downtown. He was in line ahead of her, ordering a hot chocolate for Matilda and a black coffee for himself. When he turned and saw her, he paused. "Astrid. Henry. Hi, Dwight." They stepped aside to let other customers through. The moment felt awkward, weighted with history. "How are you?" she asked. "Good. Tired. Matilda had a stomach bug last week, so sleep's been interesting." He smiled slightly. "How are you?" "Better," she said. And meant it. "I've been working on some things." He nodded, like he understood what that meant without her explaining. "Listen," Astrid said, before she could stop herself. "I know this is probably weird, but would you want to get coffee sometime?" I'm not asking you out. No. I think I could learn something from you. About how to be less defended." Henry considered this. "I'm not a therapist." "I know. I have one of those now." She smiled. "I just think you're someone who figured out how to be present even when it hurt, and I'm trying to learn how to do that." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Okay. Yeah, we could do that." They exchanged numbers. Made plans for the following Tuesday at a different coffee shop, one without any shared history. When they parted, Astrid didn't feel the usual rush of accomplishment she got from successful interactions. She just felt open, uncertain, hopeful and scared in equal measure. It wasn't a romance. Maybe it wouldn't even be a friendship. But it was a start. The coffee shop on Tuesday was small and busy, the kind of place where you had to raise your voice slightly to be heard. They sat by the window, watching January rain streak the glass. Henry talked about Matilda, her obsession with dinosaurs, her fear of the dark, the way she'd started asking questions about her mother that he didn't always know how to answer. Astrid listened without offering advice, without trying to fix anything, just listened. Then Henry asked about her work, and Astrid found herself talking honestly about how empty her career had started to feel. How she'd built this whole identity around being the smartest person in the room, and now she was tired of performing intelligence instead of actually connecting with people. "That sounds exhausting," Henry said. "It is," Astrid admitted. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" Astrid said. "Sure. That night, in the bar. How did you know? About me, I mean." Henry turned his coffee cup slowly. "I didn't know anything specific, but I recognized the defense. My wife used to do something similar. Not the same way you did, but the same reason. She'd pick fights when she was scared I was getting too close. Push me away before I could leave." "Did you leave?" Astrid asked quietly. "No," Henry said. "I learned to see past the push, to understand it wasn't about me." He looked at her directly. "But it took work, from both of us, and there were times when I wanted to give up." "Why didn't you?" "Because she was worth it," he said simply. "And eventually, she started believing that I wasn't going anywhere." The pushing stopped. Astrid felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction exactly. Or maybe it was, but not the kind she was used to. Not the shallow pull of chemistry or the satisfaction of being chosen by someone impressive. This was different. This was the quiet recognition of being seen and not judged. Of honesty, without performance. "I don't know if I'm brave enough for that," she said. "For what?" "Letting someone stay long enough to see all the broken parts." Henry smiled slightly. "Nobody's brave enough. You just do it anyway." They talked for another hour. About small things and large ones. About the parts of themselves they usually kept hidden. And when they left, walking out into the cold afternoon, Astrid realized she felt lighter than she had in years. This wasn't a fairy tale. Henry wasn't going to fix her, and she wasn't going to transform overnight into someone emotionally available and whole. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was just this: showing up. Being honest. Letting someone see you stumble and choosing not to run away from the awkwardness of it. Maybe that was enough. Spring came slowly to the city. The kind of gradual warming that made people forget how long winter had been. By April, the trees in Morrison Park were blooming, scattering pale pink petals across the grass where children played. Astrid and Henry had fallen into an easy pattern. Coffee every other week. Sometimes Matilda came along, chattering about school or her latest obsession with space. Sometimes it was just the two of them, talking about nothing and everything. They weren't dating. They'd been very clear about that with each other. Henry wasn't ready, and Astrid was still learning how to be a person who could be in a relationship without destroying it preemptively. But they were something. Friends, maybe. Or two people learning how to be vulnerable in the same room. One Saturday, Astrid met them at the park. Matilda had asked specifically if she could come, wanted to show her the new climbing structure. Henry had texted to ask if Astrid might. She didn't. Watching Matilda scale the climbing wall with fierce determination, Astrid thought about the person she'd been 6 months ago. The woman who'd sat in a bar and torn down a stranger to feel powerful. The woman who'd been so terrified of being rejected that she rejected everyone first. She didn't hate that version of herself anymore. Didn't even judge her, really. Just recognized her as someone who was doing the best she could with the tools she had, even when those tools were sharp and cut everyone who got close. "She likes you," Henry said, sitting beside her on the bench. "I like her too," Astrid said. "She's real, in a way most people aren't. Kids are good at that," Henry said. "They haven't learned to perform yet." Astrid watched Matilda reach the top of the wall and waved triumphantly. "I'm trying to unlearn it, I know," Henry said. "I can tell." They sat there as the afternoon stretched long and golden, as children played and parents watched, and the world kept turning in its imperfect, beautiful way. And for the first time in a very long time, Astrid wasn't thinking about what came next. Wasn't calculating outcomes or protecting herself from future disappointment. She was just there. Present. Ice. Open. It wasn't a happy ending because the story wasn't over. But it was a beginning. The kind that starts not with fireworks or grand gestures, but with a quiet choice to stop running, to let someone matter, to believe that maybe, just maybe, being seen completely didn't mean being destroyed. Henry had taught her that without trying to teach her anything at all. Just by showing up for his daughter every single day. By being the kind of man who didn't need to prove his worth to anyone because he knew it already, quietly, in the steady beating of his own heart. And Astrid was learning. Not how to be perfect. Not how to never be afraid. Just how to stay. How to be chosen and to choose, day after ordinary day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. That, she was beginning to understand, was what love actually looked like. Not the performance of it. Not the idea. But the daily practice of showing up for someone and letting them show up for you. The whisper Henry had spoken in that bar 6 months ago had done more than shut her up. It had cracked her open. Let the light in. And she was still learning how to live in that light without flinching. But she was learning. And that was enough.